want you to think about a referee. Not a bad referee, not a crooked referee, a good one, an experienced one, the kind of official who's been working in the game for 20 years, who knows the rule book cold, who's seen every trick, every foul, every bit of gamemanship that players and coaches alike try to get away with. An official whose whole authority, whose whole reputation, whose entire reason for being on that field depends on one thing: impartiality. The moment that the referee stops becoming or even acting impartial, the game's over. Not because the score changed and not because there was some massive event on the field. It's because that nobody can trust what the score is anymore. Now, what if I told you that the people who are refereeing the most powerful industry in America, the people deciding literally which drugs get approved and which vaccines get cleared and which medicines reach your family, what if I said those referees were one by one walking off the field in the middle of the game and going to coach the teams that they were supposed to be watching? What if I told you this wasn't hypothetical? What if I told you their names? Welcome back to Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. And today we're going to talk about something that, when you understand it entirely, when you understand it completely, it should genuinely make you angry. Not just frustrated, not disappointed. It should actually make you angry. The kind of anger that comes from realizing you were being watched over by someone who was, the entire time, angling for a job from the very industry they were supposed to be watchdogging. We're going to be talking about the revolving door. Now, I know that phrase gets thrown around a lot, and you've heard it a lot. The revolving door between government and industry. You've heard it, you've nodded at it. You and your spouse have kind of probably given that side eye to each other. It's become one of those phrases that sounds alarming the very first time you hear it, and then it kind of just gets filed away. It's just the way things work. We kind of shrug it off. It's a sad day of life and a sad fact of life in Washington, D.C. I'm here today to tell you, don't shrug. Because what we're going to walk through today in this episode is not a vague, abstract concern about influence and access. It's a specific, documented, named pattern of behavior at the Food and Drug Administration, the agency whose entire reason for existing is to protect you from an industry that will, if left unchecked, prioritize profits over your safety. And we're going to do what this show does best. We're going to name names. 3 names specifically: Patrizia Cavazzoni, Peter Marks, and Scott Gottlieb. Remember those names, because by the time we're done today, you're going to understand exactly who they are, what they did, who they went to work for, and why every American who has ever trusted the FDA to be their watchdog should be asking very hard questions about whether that watchdog was watching them or watching out for itself. So let's start at the beginning, because before we talk about what went wrong, we have to understand what the FDA is supposed to be doing for us. The Food and Drug Administration is not a trade group. It's not an advisory board, and it's not a think tank with a budget. It is a federal regulatory agency with the legal authority to determine what medicines are safe and effective enough to be sold to the American people. They are actually who decides what gets put on the shelves in our stores. That's not small power. It's enormous power. The FDA's approval or rejection of a single drug can mean billions of dollars to a pharmaceutical company. It can determine whether a therapy reaches patients or sits on a shelf forever. It can make or destroy a company's stock price in a single afternoon. And the people running those decisions, the center directors, the division chiefs, the senior reviewers, they hold that power specifically, personally. So think about what that means. When Patrizia Cavazzoni was the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, they call it CDER, she was overseeing the approval process for every single prescription drug in the United States of America. Every drug that Pfizer wanted to put on the market had to go through her center, her people, her process, across her desk. When Peter Marks was the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, he was the top vaccine regulator in the country. Every biological product that Eli Lilly had any interest in bringing through that specific pipeline, it had to clear his desk. And when Scott Gottlieb was the commissioner of the FDA, the top job, the whole agency he had oversight of it. Every drug, every device, every vaccine, every food product. When pharmaceutical companies wanted to know what the regulatory environment looked like, they were in effect asking Scott Gottlieb. The power behind these people and the power these people held was and is real. The decisions they made affected real products, real companies, real balance sheets, but more importantly, real families. Which makes what happened next worth examining very carefully. And we're going to start with Patrizia Cavazzoni. Dr. Cavazzoni is a physician. She's credentialed, she's experienced. Before she came to the FDA, she spent nearly 8 years at Pfizer. She was head of clinical science and operations. She was head of development operations. She was head of established worldwide safety and established products regulatory review. She knew Pfizer inside and out. She knew how they worked. She knew its pipeline, its people, and its culture. Then in 2018, she left Pfizer and joined the FDA. Specifically, she joined CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the very center that reviews drug applications from companies like Pfizer. By 2021, she was running it. She was the director of CDER, the most powerful drug approval center on the planet. Now hold on to that thought. A woman who spent 8 years at Pfizer learning their systems inside and out, understanding their pipeline from front to back, goes to the FDA and ends up running the very office that reviews Pfizer's drug applications. Nobody stopped it. Nobody apparently thought, hey, well, hold on, time out. That's a problem that we should discuss. She ran CDER until January 18th, 2025, 2 days before President Trump was inaugurated. And then in February, just a little more than a month later, Pfizer announced that Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni was returning to Pfizer, not as a mid-level executive, but as chief medical officer, executive vice president, the top medical authority at one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Pfizer's announcement, of course, was gracious. It was very kind. In fact, if what they said about her, Pfizer had said about anybody else, we would have probably said they were blowing a little bit of smoke. It talked about her leadership at CDER. It talked about, and I want to make sure I get this right, quote, significant innovation in drug evaluation and research with a focus on advancing public health initiatives. Lovely. Very complimentary. But here's what it didn't say. It didn't say, here's a woman who for years had final authority over the regulatory process that governed whether our company's drugs got to market. And she used to work for us. And now she's back. Now, I need to be precise here because precision matters. I'm not alleging that Patrizia Cavazzoni made any specific decision at the FDA for a corrupt reason. I'm not accusing her of a crime. The law has something that's called a cooling off period, a window of time after leaving government during which a former official cannot lobby their former agency. And she very well may have complied with that letter of the law. So here's my question for you, and I really do want you to sit with it for a second. Is legal compliance the standard we want to apply to the people who are supposed to be our watchdogs? Because here's what is true regardless of her legal compliance. The company submitting drug applications to CDER, including Pfizer, knew that the person reviewing those applications had come from Pfizer. They knew her. She knew them. They knew how she thought, how she operated, and what her priorities were. And the moment she left, Pfizer knew exactly who to call. That is the revolving door. It's not a conspiracy. It's a system. A comfortable, mutually beneficial, thoroughly institutionalized system in which the boundaries between regulator and regulated dissolve so gradually that nobody is supposed to notice. Well, I noticed, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure a few of you listening have noticed. but so did Vinny Prasad, who, for the record, now serves as the director of CBER, the position that Peter Marks vacated. He called Cavazzoni's move, and I want to quote this accurately, quote, the core rot in American regulation. And he said that the behavior was abhorrent and that it should, quote, be criminal. That's not a fringe opinion. That's the sitting head of the FDA's Biologics Center, the person now doing the job of regulating the industry, saying that the way one of his predecessors left for that industry should be criminal. We got to let that land. We got to think about that for a second, because if their own internal systems are starting to call out their own actions, this is bigger than what we ever thought it could be. Now let's talk about Peter Marks. Dr. Marks ran CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, from 2016 until March of 2025. 9 years as one of the top FDA officials for vaccines and biologics regulatory operation. 9 years of overseeing the approval process for vaccines, gene therapy, cell therapy, the cutting edge of pharmaceutical innovation. He was, by all accounts, widely respected within the scientific community. He was seen as a serious scientist, a steady hand. And when he resigned, biotech stock prices dropped. That's not a small thing. That tells you how much weight the market put on his presence at the FDA, because his judgment affected their bottom lines. He was a trusted regulator. Now, the circumstances for Marks' departure are worth acknowledging honestly. He didn't leave quietly for a better opportunity. He was, in effect, pushed out. He wrote in his resignation letter, and this was widely reported, that it had become clear to him that, and again, I'm going to quote this to make sure it's right, that, quote, truth and transparency are not desired by the secretary. He was referring to Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He said that Secretary Kennedy wanted, in his own words, quote, subservient confirmation of his misinformation and lies. Those are strong words. That's a very heated and battle-lined allegation. And I'm not going to adjudicate that dispute today. That's a separate episode, and we will get to that episode. But what I will say is this. Whatever the circumstances of his departure, whatever the political dynamics at HHS, whatever the merits of his disagreement with Secretary Kennedy, the next chapter of Peter Marks' career tells us something important and uncomfortable. Because in October of 2025, it was announced that Dr. Peter Marks had joined Eli Lilly. Not as a consultant or a part-time advisor. He was joining Eli Lilly as the Senior Vice President for Molecule Discovery and the head of infectious disease. Senior Vice President at Eli Lilly. Now, Eli Lilly is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. You know their products, Mounjaro, Zepbound, the GLP-1 drugs that we talked about in our last episode that are reshaping the entire landscape of metabolic medicine. Eli Lilly is a company whose products move through the FDA for review regularly, whose pipeline depends on the biologics approval process, the very process that Peter Marks spent 9 years overseeing. And here's a detail that I want to make sure doesn't get lost. When Marks joined Lilly, he didn't join alone. He joined with a woman named Rachel Anatol, who had been his deputy director at CBER, in the Office of Therapeutic Products. She left FDA just weeks before he did, and she's now an Eli Lilly Associate Vice President of Global Regulatory Policy and Strategy for Genetic Medicine. That's two FDA top officials in the biologics and cell and gene therapy space together at Eli Lilly. Now, the defenders of this arrangement have an answer ready. I've heard it. I'm sure you've heard something similar. Stephen Grossman, who's a policy expert in this space, has said publicly when the Marks' appointment was announced, quote, where is Dr. Marks supposed to take his education and experience other than a place where he can continue to advance medical science and patient care? Should he become a used car salesman to satisfy some people's fevered imagination that something wrong has occurred? Now, I'm going to take this argument seriously because it deserves a serious answer. Dr. Marks is not obligated to become a used car salesman. Nobody's suggesting that. But here's the question that the answer carefully avoids. What is the value that Eli Lilly is paying him for? Is it his scientific knowledge? Perhaps. He is a credentialed physician and researcher, but Eli Lilly already has credentialed physicians and researchers. They have hundreds of them. What Eli does not have, what no pharmaceutical company can develop internally, is 9 years of knowing exactly how the FDA's biologics approval process works from the inside at the top, knowing the internal reviewers, knowing the culture, knowing the informal standards that never appear in any published guidance document, knowing what arguments work, what data packages are considered complete, and what communication strategies to the FDA get favorable responses. That knowledge is what they bought. And that knowledge was built entirely at public expense. 9 years of government salary, 9 years of public institutional authority, 9 years of access to confidential information about competitor products moving through the pipeline. And then it walks out the door and it goes to work for the industry. It was supposed to regulate. That's not fevered imagination. That's a job description. Now I want to talk about Scott Gottlieb, because Scott Gottlieb is in many ways the clearest example of what the revolving door is. Dr. Gottlieb served as the FDA commissioner from 2017 to 2019 during President Trump's first term. He was, by most measures, an extremely capable commissioner. He pushed on opioid reform. He was engaged, visible, and he was taken seriously by the industry. He left the FDA in April of 2019 voluntarily. He cited a desire to spend more time with his family. And I've got to tell you, that's a reason that here in Washington, D.C., everyone hears and everyone understands. Within months, Scott Gottlieb was on Pfizer's board of directors. Not a year, not after some lengthy cooling off period, months. He still sits on that board today. Now let's think about what a board seat means. This is not a ceremonial role or title. This is not an honorary position. A board member of a major public corporation has legal duties, fiduciary duties. They are obligated to act in the financial interests of that company. They receive compensation for that service. They are, in the most formal legal sense possible, working for Pfizer. And Scott Gottlieb ran the agency that regulated Pfizer. And he works for them now. The man who set the tone, the agenda, the regulatory philosophy of the entire Food and Drug Administration during a very formative period, including the early groundwork that would shape how COVID-19 vaccines move through the emergency authorization process, sits on the board of the company that made one of those vaccines. And here's what makes Scott Gottlieb's case particularly instructive. He has remained a prominent public voice on pharmaceutical policy. He's frequently quoted in major publications. He appears on television. He writes op-eds. He comments on FDA's decisions, and he weighs in on drug pricing debates. And how many of those appearances does the headline read Scott Gottlieb, Pfizer board member? Sometimes, but not always. Sometimes he's introduced simply as former FDA commissioner, the man who is legally obligated to advance Pfizer's interests because that is what a board member does, speaking on pharmaceutical policy as though he is a neutral observer. But he's not. He's not a neutral observer. He hasn't been a neutral observer since the day he joined the board. And I want to be clear. I'm not alleging that Scott Gottlieb has done anything illegal. I'm not accusing him of anything. The cooling off laws have narrow scope. They restrict certain specific communications. They do not restrict board service. They do not restrict public commentary. They do not restrict the use of everything a former commissioner learned at the FDA in his capacity as a director of one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. The law allows all of it. And that, right there, is the problem. Now, I want to step back from the individuals for a moment because I think it matters. It genuinely matters that I say this clearly. The problem here is not primarily about Patrizia Cavazzoni, Peter Marks, or Scott Gottlieb as people. They're not cartoon villains. They're accomplished professionals who followed a path that Washington, D.C. has made very, very easy to follow. A path that the system not only permits, but it quietly encourages. The problem here is the system. And to understand the system, you have to understand how the FDA is funded, because this is where it gets interesting. Most people assume that the FDA is funded entirely by taxpayer dollars. Congress appropriates the money. The agency spends it. The end. That's not entirely true. Not anymore. Starting in 1992, Congress passed something called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA. And what PDUFA does is it allows the FDA to collect fees directly from pharmaceutical companies in exchange for the FDA reviewing their drug applications. Today, those user fees account for a substantial portion of the FDA's drug review budget. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars per year flowing from the pharmaceutical industry directly into the FDA's operating fund. Think about the incentive that creates. The FDA needs drug companies to submit applications. Drug companies pay fees when they submit applications. More applications, more fees, more budget. The agency becomes, in a quite literal and structural sense, financially dependent on the continued engagement of the industry it's supposed to regulate. I'm not saying the Food and Drug Administration is corrupt because of this. I'm saying that the financial architecture of the agency creates a structural alignment of interest between regulator and regulated. An alignment that makes the revolving door not just tempting, but in a sense logical. If you spend your career at an agency, ladies and gentlemen, that is partly funded by industry, that interacts constantly with that industry, that holds meetings with industry representatives, that negotiates timelines and standards with industry, I've got to tell you, folks, the line between public servant and industry partner starts to blur even for me. Not through corruption, though, but because of proximity, because of familiarity, through 1,000 small interactions that make the people on the other side feel less like adversaries and more like colleagues. And when your government service ends, those colleagues remember you. Now, folks, this isn't a new problem. The revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry has been documented, criticized, and largely ignored for decades. A 2016 study found that roughly half of FDA employees who left the agency and later worked in the private sector went to work for the pharmaceutical industry. Half, 50%. Of the people who had been deciding whether pharmaceutical products were safe and effective enough to sell to Americans, half went to the industry. And the argument that is always made, the argument we've already heard from Steve Grossman in defense of Peter Marks, is that this is inevitable, that you can't expect the most expert people in the pharmaceutical regulation space to never work in the pharmaceutical industry. That expertise has to go somewhere. In being the individual that I am, being a conservative, I've got to tell you, the argument there is not entirely wrong, but it's missing something fundamental. The question is not whether former FDA officials can work in the private sector. Of course they can. The question is, what safeguards exist today to ensure that their time in public service was not, in effect, an audition? What rules exist today to ensure that the decisions they made as regulators were made purely in the public interest without any shadow of future employment considerations? What prohibitions exist to prevent them from immediately monetizing, for the benefit of a specific company, the specific regulatory knowledge they built at public expense? The answer is not enough. Now, I want to address something directly, because some of you listening to this might be thinking that this sounds something that a progressive would say. This sounds like Bernie Sanders territory. Big corporations, captured regulators, the little guy getting squeezed out. And I hear all of that, and I'm going to push back on it hard, because the revolving door is not a left-wing issue. It's not a right-wing issue either. It's an American issue. And specifically, it's a conservative issue. If you believe, as I do, that conservatism is about institutional integrity, free market competition, and a government that actually serves the people rather than the connected class. The pharmaceutical market in the United States is not a free market. I'm going to say that again. It's not a free market. And I want to say it clearly. It is a heavily regulated market, necessarily so, because the product being sold can kill people if it doesn't work as advertised. The FDA's regulatory authority is the foundation on which that entire market is built. Drug companies cannot sell products without FDA approval. Investors cannot value pharmaceutical pipelines without FDA approval. The entire economic architecture of the industry rests on the credibility of the regulatory process. And when that credibility is compromised, when the people running that process are seen to be auditioning for the industry they regulate, ladies and gentlemen, I've got to tell you, the market itself becomes distorted, not by government overreach, but by government capture. There's a difference between regulation and regulatory capture. Regulation is what free markets need to function. Clear rules, applied consistently by referees who have no stake in the outcome. Regulatory capture is what happens when those referees are recruited from and returned to the teams they're supposed to be officiating. Regulatory capture does not help the free market, it destroys it. It replaces market competition with insider access. It replaces merit with relationships. And more importantly, it replaces the best product winning with the best connected company winning. And it costs the American consumer in higher prices and slower competition in a system where the rules are written and interpreted by the people who have every incentive to write and interpret them in ways that benefit the companies they will eventually work for. That's not American. That's not conservatism. That is cronyism. And cronyism has no party. President Donald Trump has made pharmaceutical pricing reform a genuine priority of this administration. Secretary Kennedy, whatever disagreements people might have with his methods, has made it clear that the relationship between the FDA and the industry it regulates is going to be examined closely. And Dr. Oz, in his role engaging on healthcare reform, has consistently pushed for patient-first policy. This is a direction I support. But let me say something with equal directness. Draining the pharmaceutical swamp means draining it at the point of entry and exit. It means not just pushing for lower prices. It means ensuring that the regulatory process that governs these prices is run by people who are genuinely, structurally, legally insulated from the financial interests of the companies they oversee. You cannot claim to be America first if the people running America's drug approval process are, within months of leaving, on salary at the companies they were just approving drugs for. That is not America first. That is industry first, and it has to change. So what does fixing this actually look like? Because I'm not interested in hosting a show or this being a show that only identifies problems. I tell my team all the time, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And so I want to talk about solutions with you. The good news is that the solutions here are not complicated. They're not radical. They are common sense reforms that most Americans, left, right, and center, would support if they understood the problem clearly. First, we need to extend the cooling off period. Right now, senior FDA officials are subject to a 1-year cooling off period before they can lobby their former agency. That's standard across the board, 1 year. That's not enough time for institutional memory to fade. It is not enough distance between the power they held and the compensation they will receive for having held it. 5 years is a more serious number. Some reformers argue for a lifetime ban on working for companies whose products you directly regulated. And I think that deserves serious debate. But starting at 5 probably makes the most sense. Secondly, we have to ban board service at regulated companies. A former FDA commissioner sitting on the board of a pharmaceutical company is not a subtle ethical question. It's an obvious one. Board members have fiduciary duties to their company. Former commissioners have, or at least they should have, ongoing public responsibilities for the decisions that they made. Those two obligations are in direct conflict, and the law should reflect that. Third, full public disclosure of all post-government employment. Every former FDA official above a certain pay grade should be required to publicly disclose where they go when they leave, who they work for, what they're paid. Not buried in an ethics report that nobody reads, public, searchable, indexed, so that when a pharmaceutical company announces a new chief medical officer or a new board member, the American public can immediately see that this person spent the last 6 years deciding whether that company's drugs got approved. Fourth, and I'm going to tell you right now, folks, this is the one the industry is going to fight hardest. Recuse and enforce. If a senior FDA official came from a specific company, as Patrizia Cavazzoni came from Pfizer, they should be formally and legally recused from any decision affecting that company's products for the duration of their government service. Not voluntarily, not on the honor system, with documentation, with oversight, and with enforcement. And if an official is found to have participated in decisions affecting their former or future employer, real consequences. Not reassignment, not a note in their file, consequences. None of these ideas are new. Some of them you've talked about at your kitchen table with your spouse. Government reformers have been proposing versions of these for years. Some have passed in narrow forms. Most have died in committee, lobbied to death by the very industry that benefits from the current arrangement. Because here's the thing about the revolving door that makes it so durable. Everyone inside it has an incentive to keep spinning. The companies want access to people who know the regulatory process. The officials want post-government careers that pay commensurate with their experience and their expertise. The law firms and consulting shops that sit in between want the fees that they can collect that come from facilitating both sides of the arrangement. Nobody in this system has an interest in stopping it, except you. The American patient, the American taxpayer, the American family standing at the pharmacy counter wondering why the medicine their doctor just prescribed costs more in the United States than anywhere else on earth. Because that system is supposed to keep medicine affordable. And it's staffed at its highest level by people who are 1 year away from going to work for the companies that want it to be expensive. Now, I'm going to close today with something that I think gets to the heart of why this issue matters. The FDA was created to be trusted. That, in its truest sense, is its function. It's not just to approve drugs. Any technical bureau can approve drugs. The FDA's function is to be the institution that stands between an extremely powerful industry and an extremely vulnerable public, and to be trusted, genuinely, durably trusted, to make the call without fear or favor. And we know that trust is not automatic. It's earned, and trust is fragile. Every time a senior official walks out the door and into a corner office at a company that they were just regulating, trust takes a hit. It might be a small one. It might be one that most people never notice because it's buried in a press release. But the hits accumulate. And eventually, and I would argue that we are getting close to eventually, the accumulated damage to that trust reaches a point where the FDA's approval of a drug means something different than it used to mean. Where FDA approved stops meaning a group of independent scientists with no financial stake in the outcome determined this medicine is safe and effective. And it starts meaning a group of people who came from the industry, who will return to the industry, who know the industry personally and professionally, decided to allow this product to proceed. That's not the same. And we can't pretend that it is. Patrizia Cavazzoni, Peter Marks, Scott Gottlieb. These are not anonymous bureaucrats. These are the people who ran the most important regulatory office in American healthcare. They made decisions that shaped which medicines reached patients at what prices. And then they went to work for the industry those decisions affected. The referee walked off the field and went to coach the team. And the game, your game, your family's game, every American who depends on the FDA to be in their corner is still being played. And I don't know what you think, but I think that you deserve referees who work for you. This is Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. We'll be back next week.
Ask your doctor about how
I'm so tired of these ads.
Whoa, who are you?
I'm Big Pharma. We spend a lot to get into your living room. Over $18 billion a year. Selling medicine you can't even get without a prescription. All that spending buys off the media and drives up prescription costs for you. And that's why there are only 2 countries that allow us to advertise. Cheers.
Learn more at bustbigpharma.com.
Got any nachos?